Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, in the Prime Material, presenting choices in your storytelling.
In the wilds, the Manticore.
And in the Tavern, what would you do if a conflict developed between wilderness dwellers and the denizens of civilization?
Let's go. Back again here, Matt.
Yeah, here we go.
Excited to talk a little bit about choice today. Before we get into the Prime Material, just a few quick announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you'll find us on all of those places. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can listen to the podcasts on there if that tickles your fancy. You can also support us on Patreon. We got some more cool stuff coming out there soon. Also, remember, whenever we hit 250 followers on Twitter, we will be giving away to a random follower a D&D sourcebook of their choice. No matter which one you want, we'll give you a free D&D hardcover book whenever we hit 250 followers. All right, choice. The element of choice is a vital part to Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games in general. Any collaborative storytelling effort has to have choices presented by the Dungeon Master. Without the ability to choose, the storytelling is not collaborative, it's just scripted by the DM. But presenting choices is what we wanted to discuss today. There's a few different things which come up with choices. There can be a couple different pitfalls that DMs can fall into. One is just not presenting meaningful choices in a good way. And one is also trying to control the narrative ourselves.
As far as not presenting meaningful choices, we can often, especially if we're just starting out DMing, get ourselves in situations where we are giving our players space to operate, but nothing in that space to really interact with that is meaningful. We can put people in wide open fields and say go wherever you want, and then not really have a reason or make a difference between whether you head north, south, east, or west. That direction needs to matter. And we can often, in the attempt to give people choice, end up giving them choices that don't really have any meaning to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as far as the other option of over-controlling the narrative, you'll recall that we discussed that all the way back in our first episode. That's an easy trap for DMs to fall into. I think often DMs, including myself, we can fall into the trap that we think that we have the best idea of where the story should go, that we can tell the story best because we have all of the extra information that the player characters don't have in our own heads, and so we control the narrative too much then. But we don't have the best idea of how our story should go. We're the steward of the story as the DM. We're not the sole author. This is collaborative storytelling. So as DMs, we have to present choices, and we have to present them well. Whenever we present choices well, that's whenever we'll find a place of much more meaningful storytelling. It makes for much a more immersive and meaningful adventure whenever we present choices well in a way that makes them matter. And this challenge of presenting choices as a DM, as we steward our particular stories, really is one of the main things that we have to work on as dungeon masters and as game masters. How good or how bad we do this can really go a long way to determine how engaged and invested our table is in the story. So today, we're going to talk about 3 things that DMs should do in order to present choices in a way that makes them meaningful. And these are sourced with permission from MT Black. MT Black is a best-selling author. You can find him on the DMs Guild and a co-writer of last year's Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. And we're going to use his framework for the 3 things that he thinks you need to have in order to present a meaningful choice as a DM, and just go through a little bit of discussion and talk a little bit about presenting choices as a DM in Dungeons & Dragons.
Mm-hmm. So the first point is that the player knows they're making a choice.
Yes.
This seems relatively obvious, but the choice has to be presented. That's part of what being a DM does.
Mm-hmm.
If all the DM does is take note of the PC's action and then have it impact the story and what's happening behind the DM screen, without the players knowing that what they're doing it matters, it's not nearly as impactful or engaging for the players.
Yeah, absolutely. The players have to know that they both have a choice and that they are making the choice. Mm-hmm. And making sure that they know that they're aware that a choice exists is the first step in making meaningful decisions. Mm-hmm. You have to set a scene in the way that the choices are clear, and that the choices, as you mentioned earlier, aren't just, do you go east, south, west, or north in the middle of an open field?
Exactly.
One of my favorite examples of players knowing they have a choice is something that you actually did in a recent session that we actually did in the game that you DM, that I play in as the character Quar. We were on an island, and you presented us with a landscape. We were seeking to track down a particular entity that was residing somewhere within that island. And Quar is a wizard, and he has an owl familiar via the Find Familiar spell, a celestial owl. And I sent him up to gather information on the island and just fly around from way overhead and just look at exactly what the landscape was. And you described the situation, and you gave a lot of meaningful detail. You described a valley which kind of narrowed down in sort of a V shape with ever-increasing cliffs on both sides as it funneled down towards just a higher outcropping of land towards the kind of middle of the island. And there was a ruined city of sorts nestled in that nook. And we had the option, just from your description of the environment, you made it clear that we had a choice. We had a choice of whether or not to go straight into that valley and go straight to investigate the ruined city. We could go to the left and go around that direction and kind of work our way up. We can go to the right and work our way up. We had different paths that we could take, and each one would have had us come across potentially different obstacles and different terrain features and different encounters. But you made it clear with just the description of your setting the scene that we had a choice. And that's so key, is that whenever you're trying to present meaningful choices as a DM, you have to make sure that the players know that they have a choice. If all you did was present the route forward and you just had us in your own head going to a certain direction, then there's no real choice that we've ever made. We've just gone straight ahead and into the heart of whatever we would find. Or if you'd asked us if we wanted to go left or right without giving us any of that information, and we've just made a nebulous choice that we don't know how or if it matters, that's not a meaningful choice. It might be meaningful behind the DM screen, but it doesn't actually give the players any more sense of investment in telling the story. It doesn't give the players a sense to tell any of their character story or build any sort of investment or motivation. It's just a random decision where we might as well just rolled highs or lows on a dice.
Right.
And there's really no recourse to it at all. It's important that we know as players that we're making a choice, that we know that we have a choice, and that goes a long way to just making the choice meaningful, because you as a DM get to sit back and just watch as the players deliberate and actually decide and make that choice. Mm-hmm. And that's an important part of that collaborative storytelling experience in Dungeons and Dragons, where we actually get to see choices like that being made.
Yep, exactly. Our next point, or the next point on the list here, is that choices need to have consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important not to present a choice that is meaningless. Mm-hmm. It just bogs down storytelling. An example that I would use is that of a maze. Mm-hmm. A maze where there's no traps. And of course, we'd never have this in any sort of Dungeons and Dragons campaign, because what is a maze without traps? But you have a maze without any traps. Every few feet, the player characters just have to decide if they're going left or right, or back the way they came. That's the only decision they have. Mm-hmm. And that's all you ever ask them is, are you going left, right, or back the way that you came? And that's the only decision they ever make. And you can go for hours of a session of that's the only decision they make. And the only meaningfulness of that is, are they going the right direction or not? And are they going to actually find their way out of the encounter? There's nothing to actually come across in the maze except for dead ends. Mm-hmm. You're just wandering around. And in the end, none of those choices matter. It would be much better for the DM to just ask for a roll, an intelligence check or something, and then based on the result, describe that it took 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or however long to actually make it out of that maze, and not present the party with choices over and over again that just don't have any consequences. Right. There's nothing that actually matters about that choice that's going to further the storytelling, other than it's going to take you a little longer to escape that maze. We have to present choices that have consequences.
Right. Part of what makes D&D what it is that you are able to impact the narrative, and giving players a space where their choices aren't going to matter kind of undermines, the whole reason we're getting together. So creating spaces where the players are going to be able to make decisions, and that they are going to impact the larger game is important.
Yes. It's also important in this vein to follow up on your choices. Mm-hmm. If you are in a particular situation where there's dragons attacking a kingdom, and your player characters have a choice of where to go, part of making that choice meaningful is to show what happens because of that choice. If they went to go flee, then it's important that they know that such and such a town was destroyed because the dragon came and there was nowhere there to fight it. Mm-hmm. If they went to defend one town, then having them come across another town, which maybe was encountered by a different dragon than the one that they defeated, shows that their choice mattered because they chose to defend one group versus another. Mm-hmm. Following up on that action shows your group that the actions that they take, the choices that the characters make, actually have consequences. They actually matter in the grand scheme of things. And that will make your players more invested and help them understand that the choices they're making actually are meaningful and actually matter.
Yeah, and not every choice needs to be as major as a city. Obviously, those are made for exciting stories.
Yeah.
But small choices should also be followed up on later. One of my favorites is in your campaign that we ran last year. We had, during an attack on a city, my character, Rowan, who was a dwarf fighter, grabbed a random dwarf soldier in the city, and when he figured out no one was in charge and everything was chaos, he sort of commanded this person and says, "You're in charge now." It's like, get the troops together. And, and it was a kind of a funny little interaction where, I just sort of, battlefield promoted this soldier, who I had no right to do it anyway. I don't know how he got away with it. But then we came back 3 sessions later after going off and investigating a thing, and I can't remember the exact details, but we went off and we came back, And this guy is still in charge of the guards, this one dwarf, and now he has a name, and he was helping us out in another fight. And he had a little bit of a character growth as NPC because Rowan had just put him in charge. And, here's the thing. Like, if I hadn't done that, it's not like it's not like we would have lost the town.
Yeah.
But the fact that that choice was remembered and had a effect on the game, even if it was relatively minor, makes it known that your choices are relevant to the players and that their contributions matter to the story.
Yes, absolutely. So the player knows they're making a choice, the choice has consequences, and finally, there's information to inform the choice.
Right.
That really helps with providing a meaningful choice because the players get to actually invest themselves in the circumstance and work out what their decision should be. When there is no information, and as we've mentioned a couple times, you've just plopped them in a spot and asked them, do they want to go east, north, west, or south? And there's no information to discern that decision. Well, how is the decision meaningful? How are they impacting the story? For all they know, you only had one scenario in mind, and whichever direction they chose, you were going to have the same encounter because there was no information to actually determine that decision.
Right. So, like, one of the ways that you can do this, and I think this works on a larger narrative scale, but I think it's helpful to break it down to physical interaction in sort of adventures. So if you create sort of a dungeon or an environment for them to explore through and just sort of make it sort of a wide open space, yeah, they have freedom and they can choose, but it doesn't really mean much. If you make it, say, a narrow hallway that splits off into 3 directions and there are 3 symbols over, the doors, and the middle door has a gate closed, suddenly you've given the players resources to make a decision. You've given them, something that looks like an arcane symbols. It's like, okay, well, now they have a choice. Do they investigate those symbols? They have a gate. Do they check out the gate and see how sturdy it is? What is it made of? And then the obvious, do they go left or right?
Yeah.
And you have given them a situation, and you haven't given them a lot of information. It might require a very difficult role to interpret what any of these symbols mean, and they may not be able to do it. But you've given them a clear signpost that what they're about to decide matters by having, a choice of directions and different symbols.
Yeah.
And then it will likely impact the future by having one of those places closed off. So this will probably, you're visually telling them what you're about to decide matters, and it has significance, even if they don't know what the significance is.
It's a great idea to always make sure that there's information that can inform the choice in order to make it a more meaningful choice. And it doesn't have to mean that that information is easily obtainable or easily decipherable, such as an arcane sigil, which the party member would have a hard time interpreting. But having information that informs the choice, even if the party can't figure out that information, it shows them that even if at the end they have to throw up their hands and guess, it shows them that there's a decision to be made here and it's important.
Right.
There's a funny instance in the first season of Critical Role where Vox Machina was coming up on the layer of the Clasp, which is like a thieves guild in Amon. And there was a door with 5 locks, and each of the locks had a word next to it in different languages. And the party got to look at that, and between all of them, they could read 4 out of the 5. They could read that one said enter in Dwarvish, one said something in Goblin that they couldn't make out, one said enter in Primordial, and there was and what they eventually deciphered was that there were 3 that said enter, and then there was one that said no, and there was one that couldn't figure it out. And it just provided this really interesting encounter because they had to decide, okay, are we picking all these locks? Are we just picking some of them? Do the others have to be touched or messed with at all? And what they ended up finding out was if they picked the 3 that said enter and then pushed on the door opened because the other 2 were false. If they had touched those, then it would have set off a massive trap that would have hurt them all. And even though they didn't even have all the information, they were able to really experience this meaningful choice and this meaningful decision in this little moment, even though the only actual aftermath of it probably would just be the simple fact of some damage being taken by the party.
Right.
They had this really interesting, meaningful choice because they had information given to them, even though they didn't even understand all the information.
Yeah. So if you are going to give your party a significant choice, you need to give them something, even if you don't, and you don't need to explicitly hand it to them on a silver platter, but there needs to be a means to get more information on the choice. Otherwise, it's arbitrary, and then what are we doing?
Yeah, and that's the key, because, we're talking about, this whole podcast, this whole episode is about making the choices be more meaningful to your party. And I think these 3 ways, making sure that the players know that they have and are making a choice, making sure that the choices have consequences and are followed up on, and making sure that there's information to inform the choice, those things will go a long way to making sure that the players have an enjoyable and immersive experience and will really help your narrative as a whole, because there will just be deeper meaning in all of your encounters and in all of your situations. Well, I think that just about does it for the prime material today. Are you ready to head out to the wilderness?
Let's get going.
All right, off to the wilds. Welcome back to the wilds.
What are we talking about today?
Little something called the Manticore. It's a very benevolent, peaceful-looking creature. Manticores are monstrosities in every sense of the word. They have the body and the mane of a lion, the wings of a dragon, and a really creepily humanoid-looking face with a giant toothy maw, and spines all around their mane and all the way down their back, and especially on their tail, where they can actually shoot the spines out of at people. But in addition to being just incredibly creepy looking, they're also very versatile monsters which can be used in a variety of different ways in our storytelling.
Yeah, one of the things that DMs can wrestle with sometimes is throwing interesting monsters, tough fights at low-level parties. And Manticores only have a challenge rating of 3, so you can kind of have access to them and have them go up against your party at a relatively early level.
Yeah.
And they're interesting things that you can do quite a bit with them. And at a low level, they can be a serious threat, too, so it can be a challenging encounter.
Yeah. And they also can be encountered in packs, and so people can encounter them in bunches, and it can be a really challenging encounter even at higher levels, too. Sometimes they're even subservient to nefarious masters if those masters happen to provide for them and give them food and the sustenance that they need. And so they can be creepy minion monsters as part of an encounter as well.
One of the interesting storytelling elements of a Manticore is that a Manticore is actually intelligent. Not particularly intelligent. It's got intelligence of 7. But it can speak and reason, even though it kind of just looks like the sort of thing that it's just a brutal monster.
Yeah.
It is a brutal monster, but it also has a certain intelligence to it.
Yeah, so it can provide an opportunity if the party wants to actually discuss and try to talk their way or worm their way out of situations. And I don't think you get that a lot with monstrosities. Usually with creatures that look this nasty and disgusting, you're talking about an entity that's not going to do anything but just, the moment you're detected, turn hostile and chase you down and try to annihilate the party. But here you just have this really interesting and versatile monster where they can be encountered at low levels. They can be encountered at higher levels. They can be encountered alone. They can be encountered in packs. They can be just solely a combat creature. And they can be a creature that you can turn into a role-playing encounter if the party's trying to worm their way out of a situation using their charisma rolls.
And a good sort of combination of these different facets of Manticore is it does mention they're often in service of powerful, stronger monsters than them that sort of utilize them, warlords and the like. And one of the ways you could easily do this is have sort of a Manticore, not quite as a right-hand man, but as like a powerful minion in service of a warlord or of a powerful like orc chieftain or something like that, where there's some repertoire between the Manticore and the warlord. And so that creates some character for your antagonist where they can kind of have some back and forths, and you just have a chattier Manticore who is working for the antagonist, but he's intelligent enough that he can engage the party while still trying to kill them. Yeah. But it makes it a little bit more, he can taunt them about their inevitable failure or taunt them about, how he's going to be eating them in 5 minutes, you can do a lot to make your encounters more, with Manticores, more interesting than just a straightforward monster battle.
Yes. And I think they're also great monsters for horror stories because of how disgusting they look, because of their very evil nature in the fact that they toy with their food, so to speak. They can be very malevolent and evil. And so you can have a situation where your party happens upon a town where different people have been picked off repeatedly by this Manticore that just keeps coming back to the town and toying with the people there. You can have the Manticore toying with the party or toying with an NPC that the party is with or something, where they're just getting to see this disgusting, nasty, evil monster try to demonstrate its superiority and really just show its nastiness in extreme ways. And it can really be a great monster for a horror type episode.
Yeah, no, definitely.
One of the other interesting things, going back to the negotiation side, is that the Monster Manual also mentions that not only can they converse, but they will also bargain. If they see that there is something to be gained by letting a creature live, if they see that they can get food or a tribute or something by allowing a creature to actually become subservient to them, then they'll actually allow that. They'll actually spare a person or a party because they are interested in receiving that larger thing down the road. And again, that's not something you see a lot with monstrosities, especially lower level monstrosities. You don't see that level of cunning, even though, again, they're not smart per se, but you don't see that level of bestial cunning where they're actually have enough foresight to look down the road and see that there's something more to be gained than there's food, eat food. And you actually used them just recently in a session in the campaign that you DM, where they actually built that sort of relationship with a bunch of goblin pirates, where the goblin pirates were able to essentially agree with them to bring them food and kind of be subservient to them.
Yeah, they had a whole arrangement of driving ships into the island and then trapping the sailors on the ships and then dragging them to the Manticore to be devoured. And it was a very neat arrangement. But that's another way you can use them, is that the way I used it was having a sort of interesting combat encounter where you got ambushed by a bunch of goblins, followed up with a slow build-up where the ranger was inspecting the tracks and trying to figure out what it was that they were fighting and following. And they figured out what it was while traveling through the woods at night, spikes started flying out at them and wounding one of the wounding your character, in fact. And once you pulled it out, they were able to identify that it was a Manticore, which proceeded to stalk them throughout the evening until they got to its nest and had a fight with it. But using the Manticore as a much tougher creature at the end of a session, I was like, okay, this is going to be the big fight that's going to happen in this session. And so it's kind of lead up to a boss encounter. But you can use their fact that they are intelligent and they can make bargains to put them in that position where they can have minions.
Yeah.
So which gives you much more options of what you can do.
Absolutely.
So a very useful creature.
Yeah. Well, I've had enough of looking at this creature, so why don't we head over to the tavern and get some refreshment?
Let's go.
All right. Safely inside of this warm tavern. There's a nice fire in the corner, mug of ale in my hand.
Free of manticores.
Yes, no manticore spines anywhere to be found. But what was the plot hook we were discussing today?
Today's plot hook is, what would we do if a conflict develops between the dwellers of the wilderness and the denizens of civilization?
Yeah, that's a conflict that has been a great source of storytelling really throughout history. You know, this conflict between civilization and wilderness. Perhaps my favorite use of it was in The Lord of the Rings, which you hear us reference often on the podcast just because we love it so much. But the conflict between Saruman and the denizens of Fangorn Forest. And you see that trope a lot in Tolkien's writings, as well as he had a very negative outlook on industry. But that trope, that idea of civilization versus wilderness, cities versus forests, is a very, very ripe trope for storytelling.
Yeah, there's lots of ways you can take it, too. One of them is kind of, I think of this as the standard sort of approach to handling this trope, which is when there is a city is expanding and they're going into a wooded area and felling trees and building roads and generally causing destruction. But you could also have simply a group of people who live in a forest at the edge of civilization are just tired of that civilization being so close to them. There could be sacred spaces that are being invaded or changed. Or maybe even the forest is this, you could reverse it. Maybe the forest is having some sort of an effect. There's lots of ways you can take this.
Yeah, I like this plot hook just because of how flexible it is. You know, your party can end up on either side of the conflict because inherently and without any extra work for the dungeon master, there's no good or bad here. There's no evil side on one side or the other. It's up to you depending on how you present the situation. You can have the city having felled trees in a sacred grove, angering treants or dryads. You can have the denizens of the wilderness seeking to reclaim something which maybe was never even theirs. They're just seeking to come in and get rid of this city for no apparent reason. And depending on how you flavor it, this conflict can have the good or the bad side on either side. It's just however you want to flavor it. And you can also just leave it ambiguous and let your party just craft an interesting narrative where they get to interact with both sides and react to what they see and choose a side based on how they want to tell the story.
Right, and since this is Dungeons & Dragons, you can make this far more interesting by drawing on what sort of supernatural element is at play here. And there are kind of two thoughts that come to my mind here. One is if the forest or the wilderness is the aggressor, so to speak, you could have like a cursed forest that's expanding. Right, and so twig blights or something are pouring out of this forest and it's becoming a problem. So you could have a sort of nefarious take there. You could also have the point of conflict be a Fey crossing. Fey crossings, for anyone who doesn't know, are points where the material plane connects with the Feywild and can be crossed from one to the other. So you get Fey, fairies, all sorts of strange and magical creatures coming through. which don't tend to get along well with civilization.
Yeah.
To the point where what keeps a Fey crossing open is it being a beautiful natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are man-made structures, a Fey crossing cannot function.
Mm.
So you could have this be a case of maybe this Fey woodland is being invaded and the Fey there are reaching out for help of we need to stop this encroachment. Or maybe your party doesn't even really care about this battle, but they need to get to the Fey realm.
Yeah.
So they end up siding with the Fey in order to tear down the man-made structures so they can get access to where they need to.
Yeah.
But by introducing, the supernatural element that is directly connected to the status of the land and is it civilized or uncivilized, kind of a lot of storytelling possibilities.
Yeah. You can also have it to where it's not even just necessarily a city interacting with the wilderness, but just individuals interacting with the wilderness. You could have things such as the hunter in Princess Mononoke, who's seeking to fell the forest spirit. You can have entities that are going into the wilderness seeking to track down entities like dryads or other sorts of forest or wilderness dwelling creatures, and in doing so anger the wilderness or the forest or whatever force is out there, and then cause a whole sort of myriad of effects based off of what actually happens through that one individual. It does not have to be a city literally being built and it's a classic city versus wilderness. It can just be the simple fact of people who dwell in civilization not taking care of or respecting their particular environment. And that can be an element of the story as well.
Yeah, most definitely.
But I think that just about does it for this episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks again for joining me, Matt.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks for listening from all of us here at Plot Hooks. I'm Samuel. And thanks from Matt, Mike, Dave, Steve, Zach, Becca, and Podcast Pupper Ellie as well. We will see you all next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.